a small hilltop town, fought over by nobody who mattered, changed hands so many times in its early history that most ancient empires didn't bother writing its name down. Today, three of the world's major religions claim it as their spiritual center. Wars have been fought over a few square kilometers of its stone streets, and more human blood has been spilled for control of this single city than almost any other place on earth. How an obscure Canaanite hill town became the most fought-over piece of real estate in human history is one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. And how it was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, and rebuilt again, over and over, for 3,000 years, reveals something almost unbearable about what human beings are willing to do in the name of God. This is the entire history of Jerusalem, from 1000 BC to 1967 AD. Around 1000 BC, Jerusalem was not a capital of anything. It was a modest fortified settlement controlled by a Canaanite people called the Jebusites, tucked onto a ridge between two valleys, with no major river, no coastline, and no obvious strategic reason for anyone to want it. Then King David, the second ruler of a newly unified Israelite kingdom, needed a capital that belonged to no single tribe, a neutral city that could unite 12 fractious tribal groups under one throne. He besieged the Jebusite stronghold, captured it through what ancient sources describe as an assault via its water shaft, and renamed it the City of David. It was a calculated political move disguised as a military conquest. By choosing a city with no prior tribal ownership, David avoided the accusation of favoritism that would have followed if he had ruled from his own hometown of Bethlehem. He then did something that would define the next 3,000 years of the city's identity. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest believed to contain the tablets of the Ten Commandments, into Jerusalem, transforming a political capital into a religious one in a single ceremonial procession. David's son Solomon inherited a kingdom at peace and used it to build the structure that would make Jerusalem eternally significant. Around 957 BC, Solomon constructed the first temple on a hill north of the city, using cedar imported from Lebanon, gold overlay on nearly every interior surface, and a workforce that biblical sources describe as numbering in the tens of thousands. The temple housed the ark itself and became, almost overnight, the singular place on earth where the God of Israel was believed to dwell among his people. Jerusalem was no longer just a capital. It was the address of heaven's presence on earth. That sanctity came at a price. When Solomon died around 930 BC, his kingdom split violently in two. Israel in the north, Judah in the south, with Jerusalem left as the southern kingdom's capital, stripped of authority over the 10 northern tribes it had once unified. The northern kingdom fell to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, its population deported and scattered so thoroughly that they became known to history as the 10 lost tribes. Judah survived another 136 years, a small vassal state maneuvering between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, until it gambled fatally on rebellion against Babylon. In 587 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Jerusalem for the second time in a decade. After 18 months, the walls fell. Nebuchadnezzar's forces burned Solomon's temple to the ground, tore down the city walls, executed the sons of the Judean king in front of him before blinding him, and marched the surviving population of Judah into exile in Babylon. The First Temple period, nearly 4 centuries of Jerusalem as the beating heart of an independent Israelite kingdom, ended in fire and forced deportation. For the exiled Judeans, weeping by the rivers of Babylon, the destruction was not merely political. It was theological catastrophe, proof, some feared, that God had abandoned his own city. He had not, or at least the Judeans came to believe he had not. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, and, in a policy of remarkable pragmatism for the ancient world, permitted exiled peoples to return home and rebuild their temples. Tens of thousands of Judeans returned to Jerusalem over the following decades, and by 516 BC, a modest second temple stood where Solomon's grander structure once had. It lacked the Ark of the Covenant, which had vanished during the Babylonian destruction and was never recovered, a permanent, physical absence at the center of the restored faith that theologians would wrestle with for centuries. For the next 2 centuries, Jerusalem existed as a quiet religious backwater within the vast Persian Empire, governed by high priests rather than kings, its politics subdued, and its ambitions modest. That changed in 332 BC when Alexander the Great swept through the region, and Jerusalem passed, largely without violence, into the Greek-speaking world. After Alexander's death, the city became a contested prize between his successors, first the Ptolemies of Egypt, then the Seleucids of Syria, each imposing their own administrators and their own cultural pressures on a population increasingly divided between those who embraced Greek customs and those who saw such customs as a threat to their religious identity. That tension exploded catastrophically under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. In 167 BC, seeking to consolidate control and crush what he saw as stubborn provincial resistance, Antiochus banned Jewish religious practice outright, criminalized circumcision and Sabbath observance, and ordered a statue of Zeus erected inside the temple itself, along with the sacrifice of pigs on its altar, a calculated desecration of the single, most sacred space in Judean life. The response was the Maccabean revolt, led by a priestly family who waged a guerrilla war against the Seleucid Empire that, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. In 164 BC, Judah Maccabees' forces recaptured Jerusalem and rededicated the defiled temple, an event still commemorated today as Hanukkah. The revolt produced nearly a century of genuine Jewish political independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, the first such independence Jerusalem had known since the Babylonian conquest 4 centuries earlier. That independence ended, as so much in Jerusalem's history would, through the ambition of a distant empire. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great intervened in a Hasmonean succession dispute, marched into Jerusalem, and entered the Holy of Holies himself, the innermost chamber of the temple that only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once a year. Pompey reportedly found it empty, a detail that struck contemporary observers as strange and significant. Jerusalem was now, in every meaningful sense, a Roman client city, and the political independence the Maccabees had won in blood evaporated within a single generation. Rome's chosen instrument for governing Judea was Herod the Great, a man of Idumean rather than Judean ancestry, whose loyalty to Rome and administrative brilliance earned him the throne despite being, by the ancestral standards of his own subjects, an outsider. Herod ruled through fear, executing members of his own family on suspicion of conspiracy, including his wife and 3 of his sons. But he also embarked on one of the most ambitious building campaigns the ancient world had seen, expanding the Second Temple's platform into an artificial plateau so vast that its retaining walls, including the section known today as the Western Wall, remain among the largest stone structures ever assembled by human hands. Herod's temple, completed and expanded over decades, became one of the architectural wonders of the ancient Mediterranean world. Vast colonnaded courtyards, gold-plated facades visible for miles, a structure so magnificent that contemporary rabbis reportedly said whoever had not seen it had never seen a beautiful building in his life. It was into this Jerusalem, wealthy, politically volatile, and religiously electric, that a Galilean preacher named Jesus arrived sometime around 30 AD and was executed by Roman authority just outside its walls, an event whose consequences neither Roman administrators nor Jewish religious leaders at the time could possibly have anticipated, but which would eventually make Jerusalem sacred to a second world religion entirely. Roman rule over Judea grew steadily more oppressive through the 1st century AD, and in 66 AD, decades of accumulated grievance over taxation, religious insult, and administrative brutality erupted into full rebellion. The Great Jewish Revolt initially succeeded in expelling Roman forces from Jerusalem entirely, a shocking humiliation for the empire that controlled the known world. Rome's response was overwhelming. The Emperor Vespasian, and later his son Titus, committed 4 legions to crushing the rebellion, and by the year 70 AD, Titus's forces had surrounded Jerusalem and begun a siege so severe that ancient sources describe families reduced to unspeakable desperation within the walls before the city finally fell. Titus's soldiers burned the Second Temple to the ground on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of AV, a date already associated with catastrophe from the First Temple's destruction 656 years earlier, and one that Jewish tradition still marks as a day of mourning. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, depicts Roman soldiers carrying the temple's golden menorah through the streets of the capital in triumph. Jerusalem's Jewish population was killed, enslaved, or scattered in numbers ancient historians place in the hundreds of thousands. The temple that Herod had built into one of the wonders of the ancient world was reduced to the platform it stood on in a single retaining wall. The city that had been destroyed once by Babylon now lay destroyed a second time by Rome. And this time, the people who had called it sacred for 1,000 years would not hold political control of it again for nearly 19 centuries. Rome was not finished with Jerusalem. Destroying the temple had crushed the rebellion, but it had not extinguished the idea of Jerusalem, and empires that fail to understand the difference between a city and an idea tend to make the same mistake twice. In 132 AD, a second Jewish revolt erupted, led by a charismatic commander named Simon Bar Kokhba, whom some contemporaries hailed as the promised Messiah. For nearly 3 years, Bar Kokhba's forces held territory against the full weight of the Roman military machine, an act of defiance so persistent that the Emperor Hadrian eventually committed a significant portion of the empire's entire army to crushing it. Hadrian's response, when it came, was designed not merely to defeat the rebellion but to erase its cause. Roman forces killed an estimated 500,000 Jews across Judea. Hadrian banned Jews from entering Jerusalem entirely, on pain of death, permitting only a single day each year when they could approach and weep at the ruins of their temple. He plowed the Temple Mount itself and built a pagan shrine to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed sanctuary. And in an act of calculated erasure that would echo for 2,000 years, he renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and renamed the entire province Syria Palestina, deliberately replacing Judea with a name derived from the Jews' ancient enemies, the Philistines, to strip the land of its very association with the people Rome had just crushed. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the city that had been called Jerusalem did not officially exist. The name did not stay buried, but Jewish political power did. For nearly 2 centuries, Jerusalem remained a minor Roman provincial town, its old identity suppressed, its population majority pagan and Christian rather than Jewish. Then, in 313 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity across the empire, and Jerusalem's fortunes turned again, this time toward a religion that had been born within its walls, but had spent nearly 3 centuries as a persecuted minority faith with no political power of its own. Constantine's mother, Helena, elderly and formidably determined, traveled to Jerusalem around 326 AD on a mission to locate the physical sites of Christ's crucifixion and burial. Guided by local tradition and, according to later legend, by the discovery of fragments believed to be the true cross, Helena identified a site beneath a pagan temple that the Romans had built 2 centuries earlier, possibly, some historians argue, deliberately positioned atop the location specifically to bury Christian memory beneath it. Constantine ordered the pagan temple demolished and commissioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the site, a building that would become, and remains today, the single most sacred site in Christianity. Almost overnight, Jerusalem transformed from a suppressed Jewish memory into the beating spiritual center of an entire new imperial religion. The transformation that followed was extraordinary in both speed and scale. Pilgrims poured into the city from across the Roman and later Byzantine world. Empresses and wealthy patrons funded the construction of dozens of churches, monasteries, and hospices. The Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking Christian successor to Rome that would govern Jerusalem for the next 3 centuries, poured resources into the city not for its military or economic value, which remained modest, but purely for what it represented. Jerusalem, for the first time in its history, became wealthy primarily through the traffic of faith rather than trade or conquest, a pattern that would recur again and again across the following 15 centuries. By the early 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, the city boasted the massive Nea Church, one of the largest in the Christian world, and a population that had swelled with monks, clergy, and pilgrims from Armenia to Gaul. That prosperity made Jerusalem, once again, an irresistible target. In 614 AD, the Sasanian Persian Empire, locked in a brutal existential war against Byzantium, captured Jerusalem after a short siege, and what followed was one of the most traumatic episodes in the city's already traumatic history. Persian forces, reportedly aided by Jewish residents seeking revenge for centuries of Byzantine Christian persecution, massacred tens of thousands of the city's Christian population, burned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and carried off the relic believed to be the true cross as a war trophy to the Persian capital. The Byzantines recaptured the city 15 years later, in 629 AD, with the Emperor Heraclius personally marching the recovered relic of the true cross back through Jerusalem's gates in a procession of triumphant restoration. That restoration lasted less than a decade. Far to the south, in the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and political movement had emerged around the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and within years of his death in 632 AD, Arab Muslim armies erupted out of Arabia with a speed that stunned every established power in the region. Byzantine forces, already exhausted from decades of war with Persia, could not hold the line. In 637 AD, after a siege, Jerusalem's Christian patriarch Sophronius negotiated the city's surrender directly to the Muslim Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, reportedly insisting that he would only hand over the keys to the caliph in person rather than to any subordinate. Umar's entry into Jerusalem became one of the most consequential moments in the city's entire history, not for what was destroyed, but for what was deliberately preserved. Umar guaranteed the safety of the city's Christian population and holy sites, declined to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself specifically so that Muslims would never claim it by precedent, and instead prayed nearby, a site later marked by the Mosque of Umar. He also ordered the long-neglected Temple Mount, left in ruins and reportedly used as a garbage site under Byzantine rule, as a deliberate insult to Judaism, to be cleared and honored, recognizing it as the location of Solomon's ancient temple and the site from which Muslim tradition held that Muhammad had ascended to heaven during his night journey. Within decades, that recognition produced two of the most significant structures in Jerusalem's skyline. In 691 AD, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik completed the dome of the rock atop the Temple Mount, a building of such architectural sophistication, gold-covered and octagonal, that it remains one of the most recognizable religious structures on earth. Nearby, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was constructed to serve as the primary site of Muslim congregational prayer in the city. Jerusalem was now sacred, simultaneously and irreducibly, to three distinct world religions, each with physical structures standing within a few hundred meters of one another, each claiming the same small stretch of hilltop as uniquely and irreplaceably holy. No other city on earth carried, or carries still, that particular burden. For nearly 4.5 centuries under successive Muslim dynasties, Umayyad, then Abbasid, then Fatimid, Jerusalem generally remained a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims coexisted under Islamic rule, with varying degrees of tolerance, taxation, and restriction, punctuated by moments of severe crisis. The most catastrophic of these came in 1009 AD, when the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, a ruler whose later behavior would lead some historians to question his mental stability, ordered the complete destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, an act of religious violence that sent shockwaves through the Christian world and lingered in European memory for generations, eventually cited as justification for the catastrophe that was coming. That catastrophe arrived at the close of the 11th century. In 1095, Pope Urban II, responding to a request for military assistance from the Byzantine Empire against advancing Seljuk Turkish forces, delivered a speech at the Council of Clermont that transformed a regional military request into something far larger, a call for Western Christendom to march east and reclaim Jerusalem itself for Christianity, framed explicitly around the destruction al-Hakim had inflicted decades earlier and the general vulnerability of Christian pilgrims under Muslim rule. The response was staggering. Tens of thousands of knights, nobles, and ordinary pilgrims from across Western Europe took up the cross and began the long, brutal march toward the Holy Land, in a movement history would remember as the First Crusade. They reached Jerusalem in June 1099, and after a siege of little more than a month, breached the city's walls on July 15th. What followed was one of the most horrifying massacres in the city's entire 3,000-year history. Crusader accounts themselves, written by participants who considered the slaughter a righteous act of holy war, describe streets running with blood, the city's Muslim and Jewish populations killed indiscriminately in the tens of thousands, synagogues burned with congregants trapped inside. Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths, had just witnessed one of them seize it from the other two through an act of violence so extreme that it would poison relations between the Christian and Muslim worlds for the better part of a millennium. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Latin Christian state transplanted onto Middle Eastern soil, and held the city for 88 years. It would not last. A new power was rising in the Muslim world, one that would prove far more disciplined, far more strategically patient, and ultimately unstoppable. And Jerusalem's fourth great transfer of power in 12 centuries was already on the horizon. The man who would end nearly a century of Crusader rule over Jerusalem was not, by birth, destined for the role at all. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Western world as Saladin, was a Kurdish military officer who rose through the fractured, rival-riddled world of 12th century Islamic politics through a combination of battlefield skill and patient consolidation, eventually uniting Egypt and Syria under a single banner for the first time in generations. Where the Crusader kingdoms had remained divided by rivalry and succession disputes, Saladin built something the Muslim world had lacked since the First Crusade: unified command. In July 1187, Saladin's forces annihilated the combined armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin, a defeat so total that the Crusader kingdom's military capacity essentially ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Jerusalem itself, virtually undefended, surrendered 3 months later. What happened next stood in deliberate, almost pointed contrast to 1099. Saladin, fully capable of ordering the same massacre the Crusaders had inflicted 88 years earlier, chose instead to permit the city's Christian population to ransom themselves and leave peacefully, and extended particular welcome to Jews, inviting them to resettle in a city from which Crusader rule had largely excluded them. It was a calculated act of statesmanship as much as mercy, and it would define Saladin's reputation in both the Muslim and, remarkably, the European world for the next 8 centuries. The Crusades did not end with Hattin. Europe launched wave after wave of subsequent expeditions over the following century, and Jerusalem briefly changed hands again in 1229, when a negotiated treaty temporarily restored Christian control without a single sword drawn, only to be lost once more just 15 years later. But the strategic momentum had permanently shifted. In 1244, a Central Asian people called the Khwarezmians, fleeing the advancing Mongol Empire, swept through Jerusalem and devastated it so thoroughly that European enthusiasm for reclaiming the city never fully recovered. The age of the Crusades was ending, and a new Islamic dynasty was about to take control of a city that, for the first time in over a century, no one in Europe had the will to fight for. That dynasty was the Mamluks, a warrior caste of former slave soldiers, predominantly of Turkic and Circassian origin, who had seized power in Egypt and built one of the most formidable military states in the medieval world. Under Mamluk rule, beginning in 1250, Jerusalem settled into nearly 2.5 centuries of relative stability, though stability, in this city's history, was always a relative term. The Mamluks were prolific builders, constructing madrasas, mausoleums, and religious schools throughout the city, particularly around the Temple Mount, embedding their architectural legacy so deeply into Jerusalem's old city that much of what visitors admire today as ancient Jerusalem is, in fact, Mamluk in origin. But the Mamluks also governed the city as a provincial backwater rather than a capital, extracting taxes with little corresponding investment, and by the close of the 15th century, plague, earthquake, and economic neglect had left Jerusalem a fraction of the population and grandeur it had known under Rome or Byzantium. The next transfer of power came not through siege or massacre, but through the collapse of Mamluk military technology against a rising empire that had mastered gunpowder warfare. In 1516 and 1517, the Ottoman Turks, expanding out of Anatolia under Sultan Selim I, crushed Mamluk forces in a series of decisive battles and absorbed the entire Levant, including Jerusalem, into what would become one of the largest and longest-lasting empires in human history. Ottoman rule over Jerusalem would last exactly 400 years, longer than any single power had controlled the city since the original Roman conquest 15 centuries earlier. The most consequential of the early Ottoman sultans, for Jerusalem specifically, was Suleiman the Magnificent, who ascended to power in 1520 and almost immediately turned his attention to the city's crumbling defenses. Between 1537 and 1541, Suleiman rebuilt Jerusalem's city walls essentially from the ground up, constructing the fortifications that still encircle the old city today and remain, to any visitor walking those walls in the present, the most immediately visible physical legacy of any single ruler in the city's entire 3,000-year history. Suleiman also restored the city's water supply, repaired the dome of the rock's exterior, and briefly made Jerusalem a genuine object of imperial attention rather than a neglected province. That attention did not last. After Suleiman's death in 1566, Jerusalem drifted back into the pattern that had defined so much of its post-Crusader history. A provincial town of genuine religious significance, but negligible political or economic importance to the empire that governed it, administered by a rotating cast of local officials whose interest in the city rarely extended beyond tax extraction. For nearly 3 centuries, Ottoman Jerusalem remained a small, walled town of no more than 10,000 residents, its old city divided into distinct quarters, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Armenian, each maintaining its own institutions, its own religious authorities, and its own uneasy coexistence with neighbors whose sacred claims to the same small space had never been, and would never be, fully reconciled. The 19th century changed everything, though almost none of the change came from within the Ottoman Empire itself. European powers, increasingly interested in the Holy Land, for reasons ranging from genuine religious pilgrimage to calculated geopolitical positioning against a visibly weakening Ottoman state, began establishing consulates, churches, hospitals, and missionary institutions throughout Jerusalem from the 1830s onward. Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, and later the newly unified Germany and Austria-Hungary all competed to expand their religious and diplomatic footprint in the city, each power backing a particular Christian denomination as a pretext for broader influence. A rivalry historians would later describe as a religious dimension of the wider, great game, being played across the declining Ottoman world. Alongside this European interest, and largely independent of it, a new wave of Jewish immigration began arriving in Jerusalem from the 1880s onward, driven by the rise of Zionism, a nationalist movement born out of the horrific pogroms sweeping the Russian Empire and the broader failure of European Jewish communities to secure lasting safety through assimilation. The Jewish population of Jerusalem, which had remained a small minority within the city for most of the previous 18 centuries since the Bar Kokhba revolt, grew steadily throughout the late 19th century until, by some estimates, Jews constituted the largest single religious group within the old city's walls for the first time since antiquity, a demographic shift accomplished through immigration rather than conquest, but one that would carry immense consequences for everything that followed. By the dawn of the 20th century, Jerusalem stood at a threshold. 400 years of Ottoman rule had preserved the city's ancient walls and its uneasy multi-religious character, but it also left it materially poor, administratively neglected, and increasingly caught between the competing ambitions of European empires, an awakening Arab national consciousness, and a Jewish national movement gathering real momentum for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. The Ottoman Empire itself, meanwhile, was entering its final decades, weakened by decades of territorial loss, financial dependency on European creditors, and internal political upheaval. Few in Jerusalem in the year 1900 could have predicted that within less than 2 decades, the empire that had ruled their city for 4 centuries would collapse entirely, and that Jerusalem would be swept into the middle of a conflict that would define its identity and its suffering for the rest of the century. The First World War arrived in Jerusalem not as a distant European catastrophe, but as the final act in 400 years of Ottoman rule. The empire that controlled the city allied itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and by 1917, after years of war had drained the Ottoman state of resources and morale, British forces under General Edmund Allenby advanced through Palestine from Egypt. On December 9, 1917, the Ottoman garrison, recognizing the city could not be defended, quietly withdrew. And 2 days later Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot rather than on horseback, a deliberate gesture of humility calculated to contrast with the ostentatious mounted entry the German Kaiser had made into the same gates less than 2 decades earlier. It was the first time in over 700 years, since Saladin, that a Christian power controlled the city, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone watching. Even before Allenby's troops arrived, the diplomatic groundwork for Jerusalem's 20th century catastrophe had already been laid. In November 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a single sentence of extraordinary consequence in which Britain expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while simultaneously promising that nothing would prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities who made up the vast majority of the region's population. It was a promise built on an internal contradiction that Britain never resolved, and one that Jerusalem, more than any other city in the region, would be forced to absorb. Under the terms of the League of Nations mandate that followed the war, Britain assumed direct administrative control over Palestine, including Jerusalem, in 1920, and the city was transformed almost immediately into the epicenter of a struggle that grew more violent with each passing decade. Jewish immigration, already substantial before the war, accelerated dramatically through the 1920s and 1930s, driven first by the search for a national homeland and then, with horrifying urgency, by the rise of Nazism in Europe. Arab residents of Jerusalem and the wider region, watching their demographic and political position erode with each new wave of arrivals, organized increasingly forceful resistance, and the city itself became the stage for repeated eruptions of intercommunal violence, most severely during the riots of 1920-1929, and the sustained Arab revolt that convulsed Palestine from 1936 to 1939. The British administration, caught between its own contradictory wartime promises, responded with a series of commissions, white papers, and immigration restrictions that satisfied neither side and radicalized both. By the close of the Second World War, with the full horror of the Holocaust laying bare the catastrophic cost of the world's failure to provide Jews a safe haven, Jewish organizations in Palestine intensified their campaign for independent statehood, including armed underground resistance against British rule itself. In July 1946, the militant group Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the administrative headquarters of the British Mandate, killing 91 people in one of the most devastating attacks the city had witnessed in its modern history. Britain, exhausted by the war it had just survived and unable to reconcile the promises it had made to Arabs and Jews alike, announced in 1947 that it would abandon the mandate entirely and hand the question of Palestine's future to the newly formed United Nations. The United Nations answer, delivered in November 1947, proposed dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, and for Jerusalem specifically, a city sacred beyond the claims of either side. The plan proposed something unprecedented, neither Jewish nor Arab sovereignty, but international administration, a corpus separatum governed by neither nation, in recognition that no single state could be trusted to hold a city so bound up with three faiths' deepest claims. Jewish leadership accepted the plan, however reluctantly, as a path to statehood. Arab leadership across the region rejected it outright, and within months, Palestine descended into civil war, with Jerusalem itself, its narrow streets and mixed neighborhoods a checkerboard of Jewish and Arab habitation, transformed into a divided battleground literally street by street. When Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, the surrounding Arab states invaded within hours, and Jerusalem became one of the war's most fiercely contested fronts. Jewish forces held the western, predominantly Jewish sections of the city against sustained siege, while a besieged road connecting Jerusalem to the coastal plain became a lifeline fought over with a desperation that produced some of the war's bloodiest engagements. In the eastern part of the city, the ancient walled Old City itself, home to the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Dome of the Rock, Jordanian forces of the Arab Legion, among the best-trained Arab armies in the region, overwhelmed the Jewish quarter's defenders after weeks of brutal fighting, expelled its Jewish residents, and destroyed dozens of synagogues, including several centuries old, an act of destruction that mirrored, in miniature, the pattern of religious erasure that had recurred in this city for 3,000 years. When armistice lines were finally drawn in 1949, Jerusalem found itself, for the first time in its entire recorded history, formally divided by an international border running directly through its heart. West Jerusalem became part of the new state of Israel, which declared it the nation's capital. East Jerusalem, including the entire walled Old City with all its ancient religious sites, was annexed by Jordan. For 19 years, a fortified no-man's land, barbed wire, minefields, and sniper positions cut the city in two. Jewish residents were barred entirely from the Old City and the Western Wall, the most sacred site in Judaism, for the first time being physically severed from the very heart of their faith's ancestral home by a political boundary rather than by empire or exile. Families who had lived on the same street for generations found themselves separated by an international frontier, watching their former neighbors and their former homes through gun sights across a scar of rubble and barbed wire that ran through the middle of a city 3,000 years old. Jordanian administration of East Jerusalem between 1949 and 1967, while providing genuine investment in the city's Muslim religious sites, was markedly less generous toward its Jewish heritage. Jewish cemeteries on the Mount of Olives, some containing graves dating back centuries, were desecrated, their ancient tombstones reportedly used as paving stones and building material for roads and latrines, a systematic erasure of physical Jewish presence from a city that had held continuous, if fluctuating, Jewish population for nearly 3 millennia. Access to the Western Wall, promised under the 1949 Armistice Agreement to Jews for religious purposes, was never actually granted by Jordan throughout the entire 19 years of its rule, leaving an entire generation of Israeli Jews born into a nation whose declared capital sat within sight of the holiest site in their religion, a site they were legally forbidden to ever touch. That division, seemingly entrenched after nearly 2 decades, collapsed within a single week in June 1967. As tensions escalated across the region, with Egypt expelling United Nations peacekeepers from the Sinai and mobilizing troops along Israel's border, Israel launched preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian forces on June 5, beginning what would become known as the Six-Day War. Jordan, despite Israeli appeals through diplomatic back channels urging King Hussein to remain outside the conflict entirely, joined the fighting on June 5, opening artillery fire on West Jerusalem and advancing Jordanian forces into positions across the Armistice Line, a decision that would cost Jordan the entirety of its Jerusalem territory within 48 hours. Israeli paratroopers, fighting through the narrow, ancient streets of the Old City in combat as intense and as intimate as anything the city had witnessed since the Crusades, breached the Lion's Gate on the morning of June 7, 1967. What followed became one of the most iconic moments in modern Israeli history. Israeli soldiers reaching the Western Wall for the first time in 19 years, some of them weeping, some praying, pressing their hands and foreheads against stones that had stood as the last physical remnant of the Second Temple for nearly 2,000 years, a wall their fathers and grandfathers had been forbidden even to approach. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan arrived at the wall soon after, and within days, Israel formally reunified the city under a single municipal administration for the first time since the Armistice of 1949, and for the first time in Jewish history since the Roman destruction of 70 AD, Jerusalem's most sacred site stood under Jewish political control. Dayan, mindful of the volatile religious geography he now controlled, made a decision whose consequences would shape the following decades. He chose to leave administration of the Temple Mount itself, the site holy to Jews as the location of Solomon's and Herod's temples, and holy to Muslims as the location of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the hands of the Islamic religious authority, the Waqf, even as Israel asserted sovereignty over the wider city. It was an attempt to defuse, through restraint, a religious flashpoint that 3,000 years of history had shown could ignite with terrifying speed. Jerusalem in 1967 stood as it never quite had before, a single city, under a single sovereign authority, its ancient walls, its churches, its mosques, and its restored access to the Western Wall all within reach of the faiths that had fought over them, generation after generation, since before most of the world's current nations existed. It had been conquered by Israelite kings, burned by Babylon, absorbed by Persia, Hellenized by Greece, crushed and renamed by Rome, sanctified by Byzantium, conquered by early Islam, massacred by Crusaders, reclaimed by Saladin, ruled by Mamluks, governed for 4 centuries by Ottomans, mandated by Britain, and finally divided and reunified by the modern state that had risen from the ashes of the very people first exiled from its walls 2,000 years before. No other city on earth carries that particular weight. 3,000 years of conquest, destruction, faith, and return, compressed into a few square kilometers of stone that somehow, against every reasonable historical expectation, is still standing, still worshipped in, and still, to this day, being fought over by the same 3 faiths that first staked their claim to it millennia ago. Jerusalem was never simply a city. It was, and remains, a mirror held up to human civilization itself, reflecting back everything we are capable of building in the name of God, and everything we are capable of destroying in His name as well.